Hi, we are here today to launch The Museum of Failure by Elisabeth Hanscombe, and I am the publisher, Jessica Mudditt at Hembury Books. Congratulations, Liz. How are you feeling?
Oh, good, excited, nervous, but good, essentially.
Yeah, all of those things. I am going to read your bio, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about your wonderful book. Elisabeth Hanscombe is a writer and psychologist with an interest in the underpinnings of all things autobiographical. Her work explores ways our experience of the past impinges on the present, particularly when it comes to trauma. Elisabeth holds academic status at Flinders University in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Science, while her expertise in psychology and literature positions her as a distinctive voice in contemporary Australian writing. So this is a beautiful book with a beautiful cover. It's a really haunting title. As soon as you first said it to me, I was like, wow, that's wonderful. Could you tell viewers why you chose this title?
Sure. I borrowed it in a way from a fellow. I read about an article, Samuel West. He called his exhibition of touring objects and services that have failed the Museum of Failure, and it tours the world. He only really began in 2016, I think. He went to an exhibition of broken relationships in Zagreb, and he was very taken by it. And so he thought, I'm going to do something similar, but with objects and services, because he really wants to underscore the point that success only comes through failure, through making mistakes, through doing things wrong. And all the exhibits in his exhibition, they're things that have not worked, but they've often led to something that has. So it was sort of like the point of my book, I suppose. Failure can lead to something else, not necessarily success, but something better.
But something better, something true.
Yeah.
And could you tell viewers about your book?
Yeah, well, the book really, it follows on from my first book, The Art of Disappearing, which I consider to be my childhood memoir. That book took me up until my sort of late teens, fairly early 20. And this one, I really wanted to incorporate the childhood experience, but really focus on my journey to becoming a psychotherapist, the things that happened to me along the way, the reasons that I became a therapist in the first place, which goes right back until when I was 14 years old. I have a very clear memory of standing at the front door of my parents' house after our father had thrown us out yet again because of one of his drunken displays and whatever. And I remember standing there. We were coming back after a weekend away for protection. And I remember standing at the door thinking, do we have to go back? And thinking to myself, when I grow up, I was 14, when I grow up, I am going to help people from families like mine. It's one of those really, really clear memories. And from then on, I started pursuing the idea of becoming a social worker really determinedly. I was only in year 9, but I contacted universities. I said, what do I have to do? And they kept saying, get to year 12, get to year 12. And over time, I got to year 12 and went to university and became a social worker, which I did for a few years, which was up to a point satisfying, but also frustrating, because I really wanted to work with people. I wanted to work more in the counselling sphere than the practical sphere. Not that all social workers work in the practical sphere, but that was very much the case then. So then I did a training in psychoanalytic psychotherapy that helped me to become the psychologist, psychotherapist that I am today. But the journey took a detour because I really wanted to be the best therapist I could be. And in those days, in my mind, the psychoanalytic world, which is probably, when I grew up, my family were very Catholic. So I grew up in the Catholic Church under those notions that that Catholic Church, it's the one truth faith, all those idealized ideas about religion and Catholicism. And I think I sort of, I left Catholicism in my late teens, but I probably translated it onto the psychoanalytic world, and I idealized that world. I got this idea that this is a great place. This is where people really think. This is where people really do in-depth work. And I began the analytic training, which was where my I suppose, my downfall. For me, it felt like a tragedy at the time, but I started the training, which was actually very difficult to get into. And I was very pleased and stunned that I did get into the training. I was quite young. I was, well, young in psychoanalytic terms. I was in my late 30s. And they, after 3 years doing that training, for reasons that's still unclear to me, though I have inklings, they dismissed me from that training, and that was devastating. My whole world fell apart internally. But I continued to work, and as part of the analytic training, you had to be in personal analysis. So I was seeing an analyst 5 times a week, and the book deals a lot with my journey through my psychoanalysis and to where I am today, really. That's the essence of the book.
And how does the Museum of Failure apply then to your own life?
Well, I suppose it goes back to the idea that because I had such a terribly difficult childhood, for all sorts of complicated reasons, I can remember as a child thinking, well, you had a bad childhood, you're going to have a good adulthood. That was my sort of trade-off. My mother had a very nice childhood and she had a terrible adulthood. So I think, okay, it'll be the opposite for me. So I thought I was on the up and up. And, things got better, I suppose, after I left home, and they were difficult, but, I met the man I married and my career was going up and up. And then when I entered the analytic training, that's when it all fell round my ears. And it's very hard to describe what the psychoanalytic world was like then, and perhaps still is to some extent today. And it can create that sort of, it was a bit of a mystery, and there was a lot of secrecy associated with it. And I think the secrecy linked to the experience of being in the Catholic Church, where there are all sorts of problems with priests and sexual abuse, and it's all compounded. So I think that's where I use the sort of sense of failure, because I felt such a failure. I never felt more of a failure than when the analyst dismissed me, and it was devastating. But I didn't give up, I suppose. I continued in my analysis. I continued to work as a therapist, and I think I'm a better therapist now than I would have been probably if I'd done the analytic training. Become more of a sort of proselyte of the analytic way rather than a more open thinker.
And do you feel, I mean, that must have been an awful blow as well, to rediscover that the world can be a cruel place. Do you feel happier in your life now?
Oh, yeah, I think the world can be a cruel place, especially at the moment in the world we're living in.
Yeah.
But I think there's something about working on ways of coping, how you deal with the cruelty of the world, which is not always easy, and you need a lot of support and you need a lot of help, whether from therapists, family, friends, whoever can support you, and also the things you do with your life. For me, it's been writing, because what happened, that's a point that I didn't make, when I was dismissed from the analyst, I went back to writing, because when I was a child, I wanted to be a poet. My brothers and sisters called me the poetess, and I fancied myself as a poet. Terrible poetry, as it is when you're young. But then I sort of abandoned that when I started thinking I want to be a social worker, and I concentrated all my efforts on understanding the psychological world, the world of mind, and more academic texts. So I sort of abandoned I suppose I never abandoned reading, but I was focused on my reading, and writing didn't really percolate until the analyst dismissed me. And then I started writing about it as a way of coping with how I was feeling, which then also led me into the PhD that I did, which I reference in the book, which was, I entitled it Life Writing and the Desire for Revenge, because when I was exploring it, I wanted to do a PhD in literature. When I was exploring it, I remember talking to my supervisor about the idea that I was so angry with the analysts. I was grief-stricken, I was sad, I was devastated, but I was also angry because I felt they had dismissed me. And I remember I fantasized soon after the dismissal, because we were supposed to go interstate for seminars and things. I imagined sort of plane loads full of analysts going off to conferences, and the planes were going to crash and I was going to survive and they'd all be dead. So this was my fantasy of revenge. And thinking about the idea of revenge, and I really stress the desire for revenge rather than the enactment of revenge. Revenge is not good. We've got plenty of evidence of how bad revenge is today. Revenge is really bad because, well, what's the expression? It's sort of, it causes bad things to happen to everybody, the person taking revenge and the person on whom the revenge is taken. It's not great. But the desire for revenge, which I think is very linked with things like shame, rage, really hurt feelings. You know, you've been hurt and therefore you want to hurt the person who's hurt you. Being able to think about those feelings and really work them through, really grieve and work them through. And the way I cope with shame is to talk about it, because I think that's the best antidote to shame. Rather than go off and hide, which is our impulse when we feel ashamed, it's to actually come out and talk about what's so shameful, because often it turns out not to be shameful at all. Really, if you start exploring it, like I felt so ashamed after the analyst dismissed me. I stopped going to conferences. I stopped having anything to do with my colleagues because it was just mortified. I thought they'd think I was a less of a person. But over the years, of course, as I process it and make sense of it, I don't think I'm less of a person. I probably think I'm more of a person, given what sort of happened. So it's that sort of thing.
Fascinating. I mean, I felt the rage, just really, who do they think they are? That this person clearly so intelligent, you could probably run circles around them, was just, and you see it, it's quite a universal experience, but I think the way it happens to women sometimes can be particularly nasty. And the lack of transparency, that is just, it's a double blow, and it's a torment that leaves the person in torment.
Yeah.
So I find your memoir very interesting, and the way that you kind of link everything back together is just so clever. But a lot of the memories in the Museum of Failure and the Art of Disappearing would have been really hard to return to. How did you kind of process that? And, you know, what would your advice be for writers who are contemplating writing about a really difficult period that's still painful and raw?
Yeah. I mean, because I had 12 years in 5 times a week psychoanalysis, I really had unpacked my experience quite intensively with another person who was, I call her Mrs. Millanova in the book, who was very helpful to me, even though, I mean, a few people have responded and said, oh, she comes across a bit woodenly. Well, I don't think of her as wooden, but I think the analytic process itself can appear to be wooden, and writing about it is always very, very difficult because it's such an intense internal experience, and you've got another person saying things to you, and sometimes the words they use, they crystallize in my mind, but it's difficult. So for me, I many moons ago, and I really think this is the most helpful thing I ever found, I did a few courses. I did a professional writing and editing course after I was dismissed from the analyst. That was my stepping stone to the PhD, and began writing about my experience in childhood, particularly, which was very difficult territory because I deal with incest, which to me is one of the greatest taboos in the world. We're not allowed to talk about it, and it is prolific. It's happening still, and it has certainly happened everywhere, and not just to women. It happens to men too, or girls. And so incest is a really difficult thing to write about, but I went to this workshop. Barbara Turner-Veselago, she's a Canadian writer, and she is a mentor of writers, I suppose. She runs these courses called free-fall writing without a parachute. So the idea is that you write whatever comes into your mind, and often it's autobiographical when you begin free-fall writing. You write whatever's coming into your mind with as little censorship as possible. You try to go what she calls fearward, and you also focus on what she calls the sensuous details. And the sensuous details are the smell, the taste, the touch. You know, it's the show don't tell concept, but she's not sold on that. It really is about allowing yourself to create a picture for the reader. And that when you do that, even if it is painful, it can sort of help a little bit to distance from the material so that you can create a world in which it was happening. It can be very evocative for the reader, but actually helps the writer. And of course, that's only first drafts. Then you've got to rework them. You've got to, the free fall writing enables you to get really solid first drafts going. And then I always say, you go back over them. That's the other thing she says. Don't read it instantly and don't correct as you go. Do not correct as you go. The editor uses a different part of your brain from the part of your brain that writes. So just write. And if you make mistakes, leave it on the page. Just write as you go. And then go back to it later. You can go back at sometime later. You can leave it for a week. You can leave it for a few hours. Leave it. And then when you go back to it, you will see that there are parts of it that have huge energy. I call them the gems, and you can take them out, and they can be quite large gems, and the rest can be, you might leave out. But it's a way of really approaching the writing, and I started doing that, and that's all I do. I have problems because I look at my keyboard. I don't look at my screen. I don't look at the words that are appearing on the screen, and every so often I press the wrong button and I lose what I've written, which is very frustrating. But a person once said they put a tea towel over their screen so they can't see what they're writing. So you can't read and write at the same time. There's something about how the brain takes in the reading that is very different from the actual writing. It uses a very different part of your brain. And then you've got that internal voice as you're writing saying, this is rubbish, this is useless. And you've got to, one of the things that Barbara Vesilago said, she said, sometimes she just gets a piece of paper on one side, she's typing away, and that voice comes in and she'll write down what the voice is saying on the piece of paper, and then she'll go back.
Wow.
And I found that I did that occasionally. I don't do it anymore because I just don't listen to that voice anymore.
Yeah.
I know I don't have to trust it.
No, you just keep going.
Keep going.
When you come to the end of the books, does it give you a sense of closure or completion? People say writing is cathartic. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I think it's very cathartic. I don't know whether I ever get to the end of anything. One of my favourite quotes is from Siri Hustvedt, who talks about writing as circling the wound, that writers circle their wound. And I think that's a beautiful, because I circle my wound. I don't tend to write during the week in a creative way because I'm working, but on the weekends, every Saturday and every Sunday morning, I write as much as I can, usually for an hour or so. And it's sort of, I have to do it. It's sort of, so if I don't do it, I don't feel good.
I know what you mean. It's like exercising. You need to get those endorphins. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are endorphins.
You haven't brushed your teeth or there's something wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. There are endorphins. That's the cathartic part to me. And it almost, sometimes I write stuff that I'm happy with and sometimes I don't. And if I'm working on a project or if I'm working on an essay or something, I never think of it as finished. I never think of anything as finished. The book, you had to come to some point for the reader where you say, this is enough. This is where I'm leaving it. But I don't feel like I'm finished. But the book itself.
But not with what happened.
Yeah, not with what happened. And yeah, exactly. I think I've put in a plug for the psychoanalytic method because even though the arcane group that I dealt with all those years ago, and it's going back 30 years, is sort of different from, I'm more involved with, we call them, it's a relational psychoanalyst. And the relational psychoanalysts have shifted from Freud's top-down model where the analyst is the expert who knows, and the person in the analysand, as they call them, is the person who's being told what's going on, to a relational model, which is very much about, we're in this together, we're working on this together, and I'm as much of a subject as you are, and you are as much of an expert as I am when it comes to exploring your journey, and we're working on it together. It's asymmetrical because I'm the therapist and I'm in a position of power relative to you at that level. You pay for the sessions, you come to the sessions, but it's asymmetrical, but it's also equal in terms of the sort of input and the work and the thinking about things. It's much more shared experience, and that's coming out of the psychoanalytic thinking, but it's evolved hugely from the days when I was doing the training.
And isn't that a good thing?
It is, and it's much less transparent. The lack of transparency within the sort of arcane psychoanalytic world is a real problem.
Did you say it's less transparent now?
It's much, I say less transparent, I mean, it's much more transparent. Yes, it's much more, you can talk about things. Analysts are allowed to write their stories. I mean, in my book, I got into terrible trouble when I first presented my work to my colleagues. Again, this is 20 years ago, because they were furious with me for talking about incest that happened in my family. Because, you know, it's one thing to happen. Yeah, but now it's not so bad. Now it's allowed. Now it's recognized that we are not, as Freud originally said, blank slates. Analysts are not blank slates onto which people can project their fantasies and their feelings. We project as well. We put things onto people as well as people. It's part of human nature. We have relationships. We affect one another. We influence one another. So it's very different than it was then. It's still valuable. Still valuable.
No, our experiences are valuable if we have the insight to learn from them, as you do in spades. Yeah. So this was published in 2017, Art of Disappearing. How do you recommend, it's okay for people to start with your new book and go back?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, it's always, you're only as good as your last book, as the saying goes. And I prefer The Museum of Failure to The Art of Disappearing. But The Art of Disappearing is, I think it's helpful insofar as I'm really going into the mind of a child. It's written very much in the voice of a child.
What I wanted to read actually was on the back of the book, it's a quote from Anne Mann.
Yeah.
Hanscombe is possessed of an unusually vivid and faithful memory to the terrors of childhood. She has the courage to face and penetrate the dark secrets at the centre of her family. A beautifully written, unforgettable account of what it is to grow up in the shadow of alcoholism and sexual predation. And you do capture that with more kind of flashbacks in this book as well.
Yeah. I have a lot of flashbacks, so I do go back because I do link my childhood experience with everything that happened to me. I think, you know, we are influenced by our past and our histories, intergenerationally. I think, you know, going back to my parents' experience, and I think particularly my father's in the Museum of Failure.
Absolutely. So can you share with us what's next for your writing, or is that something that you prefer to keep under wraps?
Oh, I don't know about another book. I mean, books take a long time, but I'm certainly doing a lot of work. I'm really interested in autoethnography, and you know, which is about immersing yourself in a situation or something that's important to you and using yourself. And it's becoming more prevalent in the academic world because academics are beginning to recognize that they are not objective researchers who look at things and have a clear view, that they are part of it. And autoethnography is about how we use ourselves to explore what's important to us. And there's lots of things that are important to me, particularly issues to do with incest. It's one of my continual wounds. I've been working with a Canadian researcher, Anais van Vliet, who is very interested in the experience of siblings in coming from families where there's sexual abuse, because the focus tends to be on the predator, the partner, the actual victims, but there's less attention paid to what it's like growing up in a family like that, where you know something's going on between your parent and your sibling, but you don't know what it is, or you do know what it is and you don't know what to do with it. And it's and I think it applies to lots of, you know, in families where there's anything going on that's unusual with one of the siblings that impacts on the other siblings. Sometimes it's when a sibling is, when you've got a disabled sibling, or, I mean, one of the things that Anais mentioned to me, they were talking about what it's like growing up in a family where one of the children are trans, and how that impacts on, because we are so dominated by our, I don't know, our binary views on gender. And I'm very interested in gender and trying to move beyond that narrow perspective that I think we've grown up with.
Do you think
construction of gender?
You were saying how prevalent incest is, but how taboo it remains.
Yeah.
How do you kind of explain, why it remains so taboo? Is there anything happening with the power structure of some people not wanting to reveal this, or what is standing in the way, do you think?
Absolutely. I think it's very connected with sort of patriarchal notions, the nuclear family, it's more often with fathers than mothers, but it does happen with mothers, but the father is head of the household, the one in authority. And also when your parent is supposed to protect you, but your parent actually abuses you, it sort of slashes the myth of the happy family, which we know is a myth anyhow, because we know that all families, as Tolstoy says, they got their problems. There aren't that many really happy families. I'm sure better families exist, but it's that it challenges our notion of how things are really, really strongly. And I think that's probably, and also because it's I can't remember his name, but he talks about soul murder. Incest is like soul murder, and to think that soul murder happens within a family is hard to bear as the idea of a parent killing a child or a child killing a parent. We want to have this idea that families are lovely places.
It does seem one of the greatest harms to inflict on someone, the very greatest harms.
Yeah.
But that also is why the lid must be lifted and something must be done, because while it remains taboo, it goes unreported and people suffer in silence. So that's why your book is very powerful. Do you know, are there many memoirs that focus on incest?
Oh, there are a lot of memoirs. Just off the top of my head, Catherine Harrison. I'm reading some of her work at the moment because I'm also working on another essay about why do we blame mothers? Why do we blame mothers? It is a really important thing for me because Catherine Harrison's stories about her sexual relationship with her father, and there's also with her father when she was 18. So it created a real scandal because people said, well, she was an adult, therefore it's not the same, which is rubbish, because we know about the power imbalance between a parent and a child. Even when a child is an adult, there's still a power imbalance that's historical. And there's all the stuff at the moment that's doing about Alice Munro, the short story writer, the Canadian, who is well esteemed, but whose daughter was sexually abused by her partner. The stories come out that Alice Munro knew about it, but didn't leave that partner. And I'm thinking a lot about the business of why do we hold mothers responsible when generally, in this instance, fathers are the perpetrators, because mothers didn't protect the children. And it's complex because I agree that there's something about the parent who isn't abusive should protect the child against the abusive parent. But it's hard to do that in a patriarchal world where women are, generalising, where women are often held down, like my mother.
Yeah, especially in the domestic sphere.
In the domestic sphere.
Yeah. So in terms of your next plans, you are going to focus on the
autoethnography. Yes, autoethnography in the context of things like, because the why do we blame mothers thing is it's the International Autobiography and Biography Association, which I sort of belong to and adhere to, which explores the theory behind autobiography, the theory behind biography, the theory behind life writing, because you wouldn't believe it, but there is a huge body of theory about why we write our memoirs, why we write our stories. And even if we fictionalize them, they're still our stories. And that's what my PhD was in, this realm of life writing. And it is a fascinating field.
Fascinating. This human impulse that we've had for millennia to record it, not just to live it, but to share it. It's like to pass on, this happened to me. Someone needs to bear witness. I can help you if you read it. I find it fascinating too.
Yeah, exactly.
Through all our cultures and through time and gender, and we all, well, not all of us wish, that's the other thing, not all of us wish to do it.
No. Yes, I remember there's a lovely book by Patricia Hempel, and it's called I Could Tell You Stories. And she starts the book, she's getting on a bus, and there's a woman in the bus who's regaling everybody with the stories. I could tell you stories. I could tell you stories. And Patricia Hempel makes the comment, yes, you could tell us stories, but whether you write them down is another matter. And there is real merit to oral history and storytelling, and people telling their stories that aren't necessarily written down. But the impulse to write them down, I think, is something else again. And people have different ways of expressing their stories. Artists, gardeners, cooks, creative people. I think we express our stories in lots of ways. For me, it's writing. For my sister, it's art. For various others, one of my brothers is an artist too. There are various ways, and I just think it's really important. It's the sort of creative impulse that I think exists in all of us. It gets stomped out of us as we grow up, unfortunately. But if you can find something
to it, that's what I find interesting is how many people return to their books, you know, in their 60s, 70s, or their 90s.
Yeah, which I think is probably linked to, I mean, for me, I remember when I hit 40, I was always interested in my family of origin, origins, my grandparents. But I think I became even more interested in, you know, where I came from before my parents. And I think that often happens to people, and people become more interested in their parents' stories, often when they get to around about 40, because I think 40, 50, you're busy with your life, with your work, if you've got kids, raising kids, all those sorts of things, and you don't have much time. And then you get to about 50, 40, 50, and you begin to sort of think, oh my God, you know, half my life has gone. What's it all about? And you sort of begin to reflect more, I think, as you get older, which doesn't mean to say that younger people don't reflect, because there's a hell of a lot of them do, and they write brilliant books. There's amazing young people who do amazing things. So I'm not discouraging youth.
Then it just deepens. It deepens with time passing. You need to have that time to be able to look back on things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to have those experiences to write about as well. So, you know, when you're young, you're going out, you're busy having them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As opposed to, I mean, there's a fellow, I don't know how much time we have, but there's a fellow who's written a book called Why Time Speeds Up as We Grow Older.
Oh, I must read that.
It's a wonderful, he's a Dutchman, Reisma, Why Time Speeds Up as We Grow Older. And he argues that it's partly to do with the fact that when we're young, our memories when we're young, we tend, not when we're babies, when we're tiny, because we only get glimpses if we remember anything, but from a certain age, 4, 5, 6, we begin to remember. And they're our early memories, and they're usually very emotionally laden. And because of this, we tend to remember them. And then we go into our teens, and that's a time of change and shift. And we often remember our teens, but get to our 20s and 30s and 40s and even 50s, when we're busy living, doing everything, we haven't really got time to consolidate. So we tend, when we go back to our childhood memories. They tend to be the most vivid. And if they're not, there's usually a reason for it.
That's so interesting.
There's lots of theories about it too.
I thought it was just because I have more agency now and I'm sort of feel more in control of my life. But when I was a child, I was waiting for the bell. I was waiting for mum to pick me up, and it kind of would stretch out, you know, whereas now I always say, if you're in prison, the time passes very slowly. If you're having an enjoyable life, it will speed past. And so I feel like it's fine that I'm just enjoying my life, but it does terrify me how quickly the weeks flash past.
Yeah, well, he uses a metaphor, this Dreismer. He uses a metaphor. He says, when you're a baby and you're crawling alongside a river, you're going very slowly relative to the river. Then when you get into your teens, you're running alongside the river. You're even faster than the river. And then as you get older, the river goes faster than you go, particularly when you get into old age, when you hardly move. And he's using time the river as a sort of metaphor for time, because the river flows at the same pace. It doesn't actually, if you think about weather, because sometimes rivers go very fast and sometimes they go slow, but it's
Yeah,
an interesting
that's
idea.
fascinating. I've written down that title. Now, could you please tell viewers about the details of your
Oh, yeah, my launch.
Melbourne?
Yes, it is happening in Melbourne. It's happening in the Moat, which is in Little Lonsdale Street. It's just under the Wheeler Centre. The Wheeler Centre is in it's over the road from QV, Queen Vic. So it's in Lonsdale Street, in the city, Little Lonsdale Street. And it's happening on Saturday, the 8th of March at 4 p.m, from 4 p.m. till 5:30 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon.
And how can people RSVP?
Look, I'm not even that fussed about RSVPs. If people would like to come and they can come, we can accommodate, well, hopefully we can accommodate everybody that comes. I don't know how many people are coming.
Fantastic.
And I'm a little bit on the spontaneous side. I don't like things to be too well organised. Mind you, the Moat is well and truly organised, and there will be drinks at the bar and things like that. And I just want to say Carrie Tiffany is going to launch it. Carrie Tiffany is a wonderful, wonderful writer, and she has won many awards for her beautiful writing. And she is also a friend. We started our PhDs together, and she is going to launch my book, and I'm very honoured and very, very pleased that she will be able to do that for me. So
amazing. Okay, Saturday, 8th of March.
Yep, excellent.
Okay.
Thank you. Anybody can Google or email or whatever. I can fill
along. Wonderful.
Excellent.
Well, Kay, thank you very much for giving us your time today to launch your book and to hear just, fascinating insights from you, both professional and personal.
Yep. Thank you for your time, and thank you for all your help. You have been exemplary. You have been wonderful. I can't tell you what a ray of sunshine you are, and what a hard worker, and how fantastic you are. So I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you, Liz. It has been
good.
Wonderful working with you. It's been so enjoyable. We have been like just going down a river.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. Thank you.